All right, so this video is going to be one of the most important videos that I actually ever make. So this is going to be about, as you can tell by the title, progressive overload and what it is and what it isn't and how to go about it properly for the purpose of hypertrophy. So this has been something I have learned a ton of throughout my years of lifting, and mostly through experience, a lot through, yeah, maybe some science and some information here and there, but this is truly something that I think pretty much only advanced lifters do understand. Not because they are better at lifting or not because they have bigger muscles or higher strength numbers, but it's because of the experience and the way that they got to those numbers and the way that they got to that muscle size. That is why they know how this works. So before I really get into the video, the first thing I really want to say is I want to thank Stan Strength for his response to my problem with the Big 3 video. I appreciate the effort that you made to clarify which arguments were mine and which arguments were from other people, because at the end of the day, I don't necessarily agree with the other videos that were made entirely. My video obviously was different. That's why I made it. So at the end of the day, that's that. I definitely appreciate how thoughtful your response was, and I want to share how much I enjoyed it. I do really appreciate just the thought you put into everything, and you didn't just kind of glaze over my arguments, or you're clearly not stuck in your ways is what I'm trying to say. You're open to new information, and at the end of the day, the purpose of this channel is to present new information and present some arguments. So if you can be somebody like Stan Strength and just kind of humble yourself and be open to new ideas, but also not be afraid to challenge what you think is wrong of what I say, that is at the end of the day what the purpose of this entire channel is in the first place. So I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to be the person that finds what's right. Will I be right along the way? I hope a lot of the time, and I think I am. That's why I make these videos. But at the end of the day, nobody's perfect. Nobody's right all the time. We're here to build a community. We're here to challenge each other and find what's right so we can all be successful. So I did really enjoy your response. It was long, it was thoughtful, and it was thorough. I do really appreciate that. I think between the two of us, we can help the community a ton based on our responses to each other. I think we both have good knowledge in separate areas of lifting, but we also do have a decent amount of crossover as well. Obviously, I'm a bodybuilding focused channel. I have dabbled into powerlifting, hit some decent numbers, and obviously Stan Strength, he's been on kind of both sides of the spectrum too with this. Obviously, he's more powerlifting focused, but he does do power building, as he says. Clearly has a pretty good physique too. So yeah, he's got a decent amount of muscle. He knows what he's talking about. So I think with our specialties, we can complement each other pretty well, and these responses to each other are overall good for the lifting community. So now to get into the video. I have a lot of bullet points here that I want to make. And like I said, this is going to be a very important video, at least in my opinion, probably the most important video, if not maybe the top 2, top 3 that I ever make. So I do want to start this off by saying this is not an anti-progression video. This is an anti-artificial progression video. I'll explain that obviously throughout this video. So keep in mind, I am discussing hypertrophy training, not powerlifting. This is a bodybuilding channel. So if you're a powerlifter, or if you are training for strength, this doesn't necessarily apply to your training. It might not. Really tough to tell. Obviously, it's not very black and white. So basically, the first thing I want to start off with is that your training needs a standard technique and form on every lift if you want to track progression over time for hypertrophy. So to give you an example, when I hit my first bench plateau, I was doing a 5x5 program. I started at 225. I kind of just got up to that for basically from random bodybuilding training. You get stronger, noob gains and whatnot. So did 5x5, plateaued at 250. What did I start doing there? I arched my back a little more. I widened my grip up a little more. Do you know what happened then? I could bench 255. The problem with this is that's artificial progression, because you can't tell if I got stronger from building muscle or from building skill, and I'll explain that in a minute here. Your training needs a standard technique that you base your strength numbers off of, and that's going to be very important for your long-term tracking of your progressions over time in hypertrophy training. So there's a difference between the form for powerlifters and the form for bodybuilders. So obviously with bodybuilders, we want to make the lift as difficult as we possibly can, not to an extreme, but you want to make the lift challenging. You want to go through the full range of motion. You want to make sure you go a little slower to make sure it's a little bit more challenging. With that being said, powerlifting is actually kind of the opposite. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, you need to get the weight from point A to point B. That's essentially what powerlifting is. That's why you've seen those videos of powerlifters that bench with a huge arch, super wide grip. They go down 2 inches, then they press it up, and they can bench like 455. So that is essentially useless for bodybuilding. For powerlifting, you want to improve your skill. You want to decrease your range of motion so you can put up bigger numbers. It does not matter as long as you fall within the guidelines of a proper lift. It does not matter how you did it. You want to basically hide away your weaknesses as much as possible and expose your strengths as much as you possibly can, such as conventional versus sumo deadlift, a high bar versus a low bar squat. Depending on which muscle groups you have that are dominant, certain movements will emphasize one another. And that's ultimately why powerlifters will try and vary their form to play their strengths and hide their weaknesses. An example for me was I ran away from my weakness on a lot of lifts. I started doing, let's just say I started lifting, and I'm talking about powerlifting here for a second. When I started benching, I just did a regular just outside shoulder width grip, just very standard, elbows at like 45 degrees like this, coming down maybe 1.5 times shoulder width. Eventually I found out my weakness was my triceps. So what did I kind of naturally do without realizing it? The grip gets a little wider every time. Decrease the tricep activation a little bit, make it more of a chest movement, and basically decrease the range of motion, which is ultimately basically counterproductive for hypertrophy training. So let's see what I got here. Another example would be squats. I started off on high bar squats, but sure enough, I realized that over time, my quads were very weak and I was naturally kind of back dominant. I was glute dominant, hamstring dominant. So I turned it into more of a low bar squat, and not more, it was a low bar squat. So my numbers kept going up, but at the same time, it doesn't matter which movement I was training with, because the weight on the bar is actually going to be arbitrary when you change your form like that. So that's why you need some form consistency. So real progress for hypertrophy training is adding weight to a consistent lift with consistent technique. That's why you need a standard technique and a standard lifting form for every lift, because you can cheat to add more weight to the bar, but this is not productive at all for bodybuilding whatsoever. So real progress is, what did I do to this? Oh, there we go. So real progress is adding weight to a standard lift. Artificial progress is when you either hit a plateau or hit what you think is a plateau, but it's actually just tough to tell because adding 5 pounds to your barbell curl, that's 60 pounds, is actually, I'm not going to do the math off the top of my head, but what's that, 15%, 18% of an increase? Yeah, you probably didn't hit a plateau, but you just couldn't tell because you're not adding 1 pound to the lift. You probably just got stronger at that 60-pound curl. So, side tangent over. Basically, artificial progress is doing whatever you can to get the weight up, regardless of form. So that would be widening your grip on the bench, switching from a high bar to a low bar squat to add a little bit of weight to the squat. This is basically defeating the purpose of your bodybuilding technique, because now you're making it actually less optimal for challenging that muscle, and you're making it more optimal for powerlifting. That's really what it comes down to. And it's like I said earlier about how powerlifting works. So for bodybuilding, increasing the strength in a way that a powerlifter would could technically be artificial progress for bodybuilding. Real progress, to summarize, is adding weight to a movement where your form and technique is basically exactly the same. And this takes time, guys. This isn't something where you can add 5 pounds every week to any lift. It's I'll explain this in a minute here, but if you aren't progressively overloading throughout your training, it's most likely because a fundamental is missing in your training. So you will achieve progressive overload from using hypertrophy fundamentals, not the other way around. You don't use progressive overload to get bigger. You use the hypertrophy fundamentals to achieve progressive overload. Everybody has this backwards. So there are 4 necessities in your hypertrophy training that will make progressive overload happen regardless. It's going to be your volume. You have to be in a certain threshold of volume. You have to be in a certain proximity to failure. You have to have exercise selection that fits your needs, and you have to have proper frequency. I'll detail all those out in the future. I don't have time in this video to go through what every single one of those is, but just know I will go through that in the future. If those are all happening in your training, progressive overload is going to happen. And yeah, you're going to go through times where it's slower, times where it's faster, and that's okay. We're talking long-term here. Muscle doesn't build crazy amounts overnight or in a month or 3 months or 6 months. This is a long-term, sustainable way of training to achieve progressive overload. So day-to-day performance does not matter as much as long-term performance. So let's look at this, for example. When you're training at your highest standard every session, there will be small variables that can change a session's performance. Let's say you sleep a little bit less. Maybe it's a Friday and you're more tired after a long week of either work or training, so you have a little bit more fatigue built up. Let's say it's a Monday and you took Sunday off and you got to sleep in on Saturday or whatnot. Now you're going to be primed. So the day-to-day training sessions, they will fluctuate, and you just have to get used to that, because over time, if you do this, you're still progressing up, even though the day-to-day might be fluctuating a tiny little bit. So I do have a program that actually covers how to do that properly, and it does basically track your progress for you on a line chart. So it's going to be a free program. I'm just going to basically turn what I have into a Google Sheet. I'm going to put it somewhere in a video's description. You guys can all use it 100% for free, no cost whatsoever. I'm here to help people with this. So let's see. You won't be noticing daily progressions besides beginners. Beginners, yeah, you can add some weight, especially on compound movements with consistent form relatively quickly. But other than that, daily progressions in bodybuilding is very, very minuscule. Very, very minuscule. So don't worry about noticing daily progressions. You want to measure month after month, quarter after quarter, year after year. That's where the progress is. And that's why the day-to-day progressions literally don't matter. Don't quote me on that. It's not that they don't matter, but if you go backwards a tiny little bit, it is not the end of the world, as long as you're progressing over time long term. So let's see. Next note I have here is progressive overload as the primary focus is for powerlifters. So powerlifters, they need to do whatever they can. They need to absolutely maximize their technique and their form to press, squat, or deadlift as much weight as they possibly can. This means if they can press more on a bench with a wider grip, you need to do a wider grip. Do not sacrifice showing a weakness in your triceps by trying to do a close grip bench because it looks better or whatever. You need to do whatever you can to get as much weight up as you possibly can, and that is 100% what powerlifting is about, and there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. The problem is when you apply those to bodybuilding, that's an issue because you're sacrificing your technique. Progressive overload as a long-term secondary focus is for bodybuilders. If you're just focusing on progressive overload, you will run into issues at one point or another if you're trying to build muscle and train for hypertrophy. I'll get into that in a second here. So basically, if you're focusing on day-to-day progressions and short-term progressive overload, and that's the primary focus of your training, and you are training for bodybuilding, you will, and I promise you, this will happen whether it's your first 2 months, whether it's a year and a half, 2 years into training, you will end up sacrificing the future for the ego of the present. That is a problem, and I'll explain that in a minute. I have a couple quotes here that I wanted to write down that these, I'm not quoting it, I'm just quoting myself here, but I do want to make sure I say these properly. So Progressive overload can be confusing for bodybuilders because constantly adding sets and reps isn't sustainable for very long, so we resort to adding weight. This can be tough because lifters generally tend to be emotionally invested in their strength numbers. It's just natural. This makes it easy to sacrifice hypertrophy fundamentals in order to achieve artificial progress. This is nearly guaranteed to come up in every bodybuilder's training at one point or another. The problem is when you sacrifice form once, you have two options moving forward. You keep it that way and continue making progress while sacrificing your technique for the rest of your lifting career, or you decide to regress back to where you started, or not started, but where you made that change in the first place, and sacrifice your technique, and you resume your regular training. You can solve this by understanding the up and down progression and short-term plateaus and being disciplined enough to recognize when you're starting to cheat. This is huge for bodybuilding. If you're not aware of this, you are absolutely going to sacrifice technique and form at one point or another to try and artificially create progressive overload. It's just the way it is. It's just natural. And you're not a bad person if you do that. You just have to be aware that you will be sacrificing progress in muscle building. And I say this out of my own experience. I've been there. I started training 100% like a powerlifter, and my muscle gains slowed down because of it. Let's see. So the next point that I have here, not really a point, but kind of just a suggestion. I recommend filming your lifts every now and then to ensure consistency, because even if you don't make a drastic change within one workout, there can be subtle changes over time that you don't even notice. But if you film, let's say, one set of each exercise every month, and you somehow store that on a photo album or something on your phone, you can actually check to see if anything's changed. You can compare that first video to the next month, or let's say you're looking back from February of 2021 to February of this year. You can say, okay, form's exactly the same. I'm strong on this movement. Guaranteed that I built muscle from it. Another thing you can do is, let's say you saw this and you had great form February of last year, and this year you did the rep way faster, but you're doing it stronger. You don't necessarily know if you built muscle from that movement. So the conclusion that I want to leave this video on is that progressive overload is best used as accountability to make sure that you're making progress. So basically, like I was saying earlier, you have to kind of swap your way of thinking with progressive overload. Your hypertrophy fundamentals will cause progressive overload to happen, not the other way around. You can't force it. The only way you can achieve progressive overload is through nailing those 4 fundamentals of hypertrophy training. Obviously, there's more to it than just those 4, but that's ultimately going to be the 4 staples in your training. So what I'd recommend from here is implementing this mindset. It's going to make a massive difference. I'll show you a brief example of what I'm doing with my training. Like I said, this is going to be in a Google Sheet, because obviously I can't just be I can't be mailing out pen and paper programs to people, but you're not going to be able to read my handwriting. It's very terrible. But basically got every exercise over here listed, and then I have the weight that I used up top, and then the amount of reps that I achieved in 3 sets written beneath it. In this way, yeah, I mean, you're going to see certain fluctuations. So let's see, I've done 10 cable preacher curls that I've done here. The first time I did those, which was probably one of the first days of January, and not the first time I did them, this is the first time this year that I did them, I did 40 pounds on the cable, and I got 44 total reps over 3 sets. Let's see. The next session, I added some weight, so I went up to 45, and I only did 37 reps. The next time, I did 45 pounds, and I got 45 reps. Right now, I'm at 50 pounds for 45 reps. So that's progress over time. That's 10 sessions later. In the meantime, there's sessions that I've regressed on. The problem is, for those regressions, is I progressed more often than I regressed. So in the long term, I made progress. It's one of those things where you do a step forward, step forward, step forward, step backwards, forward, forward, backward, forward. You get where I'm going here. So with that being said, I pretty much got everything that I wanted to go over out on this video. Like I said, this is an important one, so I hope you guys at least learned something. If you have any questions, definitely leave a comment. Feel free to make a response video like Stand Strength did for my last video. And yeah, there's a lot more to this, but this is kind of like the general base of what I wanted to go over for this video. Lots of my videos will be branching out on certain touch points ahead here. But yeah, with all that being said, that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching.